All right, everybody. So we just talked about different types of cereal grains and their importance in our diet. We showcased wheat, rice, and corn, and talked about how wild rice isn't actually related to the rice that's domesticated that most of the world eats. One really important point is where we're ending off talking about this idea of the green revolution. And so this was targeted genetic breeding that was meant to help overcome the threat of world hunger, particularly in these staple food crops, which are wheat, rice, corn. And the focus was on disease resistance, improving yield, and helping plants overcome poor growing conditions such as poor soil conditions or drought. This effort, which took place in the 1960s, showcased by Norman Borlaug, was really successful, ended up leading to him winning a Nobel. And really, over the last 40 or 50 years since all of this work took place, since like the 60s to the 80s, we've sort of moved into a new revolution, which is genetic engineering, which allows you to modify the genes in plants using genes from unrelated plants, which really has been a huge change in technology. One application of genetic engineering I'm just going to mention here, and we'll talk more about in another unit, is this application of producing golden rice. One of the things we talked about is how white rice is a major food crop, and yet there's not a lot of nutrition to it. It's really just eaten for carbohydrates. And because of that, and in addition to the fact that a lot of nations that eat white rice also have a low or no meat or diet, and that means that some of the nutrients you would get from meat are missing, such as vitamin A. And vitamin A is used in eye health or used by the body to prevent blindness. In fact, vitamin A is really important for development and use of rods and cones and helps with visual acuity. And so without vitamin A in the diet, it leads to blindness, and it's the leading cause of non-accidental blindness in the world. So plant breeders worked using this genetic engineering technique to transform white rice to have one gene that expresses vitamin A. So even if you're not getting vitamin A in any other way in your diet, you can eat this white rice that's now been transformed to have this vitamin A gene. Couple of considerations. One, it's new. Two, it changed the color of the rice. Three, it used this technology that is not widely accepted. So while it was a good solution, it missed the mark. We don't even see this in our diet today because it really hasn't made its way into the food supply yet. So it's a really neat solution to a problem, but it hasn't been adopted yet. Now, today in lab, we looked at different cereal grains, and I mentioned that there were some other grains that we would consider pseudo grains. They're grains that we would cook like the ones that we normally do, like rice and wheat and corn. But then they're pseudo because they come from plants that are not grasses. So a good example of this would be quinoa. And in this case, it's a plant that is not a grass at all, but we treat it like grass. It belongs to the amaranth family. So amaranth is another one that is not a true cereal grain. So in the case of quinoa, it's native to the Andes region of the world. It's very high in protein, which is actually higher than most other cereal grains. One of the considerations too when you're cooking it is you need to soak it in water to remove some of the bitter flavor that comes from a particular compound or group of compounds called saponins. And so if you're cooking this at home, definitely leach out that set of saponins by sitting in water or rinsing it a few times. Now, barley gets mentioned in the Bible, and it was originally domesticated in the Fertile Crescent, similar to wheat. And this one is a cereal, true cereal grain. And it plays a huge role in culture, especially in Egyptian culture. It has its own hieroglyphic symbol. We can eat it like similar to how you'd eat oatmeal, but it can also be savory. What's interesting to note about barley, though, like wheat, it does contain gluten. Okay, so anything that's made with barley is an issue for somebody that is gluten intolerant. Now, oats are another type of grain that we can say it's an alternative to wheat as far as a carbohydrate source, and it's originated from Asia. And two of the ways that you would see oats in production would be rolled oats. These are literally the seeds rolled out flat, or steel cut oats, where they're cut into small little pieces, and sometimes they're called groats. We eat oats as oatmeal and in like savory or sweet preparations. It can also be used for livestock feed. Millet is another one that we've said is a lot of time we see this as birdseed. We can also see it exemplified in Indian cuisine as chapati or flatbread or roti. And this point of origin is both millet is produced or domesticated both in Asia and Africa simultaneously. And we see it in Indian, Chinese, and Nigerian or Niger as where it's produced most often today. Now, rye is a cereal crop that is distantly related to wheat, so it's truly a cereal. And it was thought to be domesticated in what was Asia Minor. And now it's primarily grown in small amounts in Eastern, Central, and Northern Europe. And we saw it in lab as a type of flour. It's used to make breads, beer, whiskey, other alcoholic beverages. And one of the things about rye is that you can grow rye in the winter like you would grow like a winter wheat crop, and it can serve as a cover crop, but you can also harvest it in the spring. One other consideration is quite susceptible to ergot, which is similar to wheat's problem. Now, interestingly enough, couscous is not a grain. It's actually a very small pasta made from wheat, and originally produced as a food in North Africa and Syria. The wheat that is grown to make couscous is typically out of Morocco, and we tend to see it in soups and stews and treated like a pasta. Now, one of the other things that I wanted to talk about for a little bit is use of forage grasses. So forage is really anything that animals can make use of. So there are a mix of grasses that would count for forage for animals. Alfalfa, sorghum, oats, like we said, and some other grasses like bent grass and fescue. And this is good for pasture animals. So this can be for animals that are allowed to graze in the field, but it can also be harvested as hay. So we just talked about rye as a cereal crop. Rye can also be grown out perennially, which means it will come back year in and year out and can be used for animal feed. And it does have some pest issues, but in general, it's pretty easy to grow as a crop. Other small grains like the oats that I just talked about are also food for our forage animals. And I wanted to mention Kentucky bluegrass. Kentucky bluegrass is the typical grass you would find in your lawn, but it can also be used as a forage grass for animals. And then sort of wrapping things up here, alfalfa is considered the queen of the forage. It is good for hay silage. It produces a flower, which helps support pollinators, and it's a perennial. You might be most familiar with alfalfa as it's used in alfalfa sprouts and salads. And then we have millet, which is similar to sorghum. And pearl millet is probably the most common one that you might be familiar with. And it has a point of origin in Africa. And we tend to see millet as a grain crop, but also for forage. Now, the last thing that I wanted to talk about is I'm having you read this book that is from The Coming Famine, and it's chapter 7 called Losing Our Brains. And so it's talking about cereal crops and the work that's done at the CIMMYT, which is similar to work that was done by Norman Borlaug. Now, Cornell and the Gates Foundation have been doing work that surrounds this issue, and it talks more about the Green Revolution. And while we can see the Green Revolution having made some huge strides, there were definitely some challenges with the strategies implemented by the Green Revolution, Norman Borlaug. And we can also see that there are sort of bumps in the road with private and public research. And genetic engineering or genetic modification definitely plays a role. So what I want you to do is I want you to review your homework, and if you're watching this in lieu of coming to class because you were ill, I'd like us to have a one-on-one discussion about that chapter. Thank you.